Alex Gladstein is a monumental figure in the Bitcoin world. When most of us are looking at the issues that temporarily present themselves to us as problems, whether or not our financial advisor will allow us to invest in Bitcoin, whether or not we get taxed in order to buy a steak burger, Alex Gladstein is looking at the reality of the world. 7 out of 8 people across the globe are living under regimes where they do not have financial freedom. They can have their money taken away, seized, frozen for political views, for protesting, for doing something that in the United States and most of the Western world we simply take for granted. Alex Gladstein has been focused on alleviating the pain of financial repression for those people. As the leader of the Human Rights Foundation, he was working hard to do that through traditional means. And when he discovered Bitcoin, he realized that it was the greatest tool of freedom that he could use in order to help bring people away from these issues. And so he's changed the focus of his charitable efforts in order to bring freedom to these people. The author of Check Your Financial Privilege and Hidden Repression, which we may get to in due time, Alex has recently published an article in the Journal of Democracy that we feel warrants discussion. And to lead us on that conversation, Mr. Grant Reich.
Hey, thank you. That was an excellent intro. I really appreciate it that we get a chance to discuss this because we all have our orange pill story if you're in the Bitcoin space. And Gladstein is mine. This is the first book that really got me to understand Bitcoin, check your financial privilege, or rather to understand why Bitcoin is a revolution, why it's important. One amendment to your introduction, because I think Gladstein would say it if he was here, in a sense, he's the leader of the Human Rights Foundation, but he's the chief strategy officer.
Right.
So, it's a huge foundation with a lot of effort going into it, I'm sure. As the chief strategy officer, I don't know what a chief strategy officer does, but I assume they strategize. And so in some sense,
Calling the plays.
Yeah. So we're discussing Why Bitcoin is Freedom Money by Alex Gladstein, as Lucas mentioned, in the Journal of Democracy. We've probably all heard of pro-democracy activism, of the need to spread democracy, of the evils of censorship, election rigging, political prisoners. But what Lucas was talking about, financial repression, monetary repression, that's less discussed. How often do we hear those same sources, pro-democracy advocates, talk about the corrupt monetary systems of other countries over our own? And yet, new digital currencies can be used to surveil the economy at a very granular level, now technologically capable of doing it for the individual transaction, seeing what you're buying. Authoritarian leaders can inflate currencies to fund their police states, wars, lavish lifestyles. The censorship of a journalist, maybe the kind of prototypical concern of a democracy advocate, is undoubtedly important, but financial repression affects every member of an authoritarian society, including that censored journalist, obviously. And it's indeed one of the ways financial repression then that authoritarians cement their authoritarian rule. This essay gives specific examples of how financial repression occurs, how Bitcoin can serve as a powerful tool against financial repression, and how pro-democracy advocates who may have previously not given it enough focus can integrate Bitcoin into their operation to further their purpose of preserving democracy, civil liberties, etc. The essay, I think, can kind of be divided into 2 parts. The first part talks about how financial repression is occurring across the world and how Bitcoin has already been used to address that. And the second part addresses some of the concerns or questions that kind of, you might say, Bitcoin curious pro-democracy advocates might have about how they can use Bitcoin integrated into their existing operations. So, embarking on a discussion of the first part then, or rather a summary, as Lucas and I always do. First, we'll give a summary, a substantive summary of the article, which I've already begun doing, so that we can have on the table the actual substance of the article. So when we talk about it, we're not just talking about some straw man confection of what we think the author is talking about. So how does financial repression occur? First, financial repression can occur in the form of debanking. 5.7 billion people in the world live in or under rather authoritarian regimes where the monetary rails, the ability to do transactions, use the money, are compromised or controlled by the state. Democracy advocates in these countries can't really fundraise, pay their employees, or save money for future endeavors, and it's tough for foreign donors to get money to them into that authoritarian state. The foreign government is going to see that a grant arrived into a bank account. If it arrives in traditional financial ways, can then freeze, seize, and then arrest the holders of the account. But Bitcoin, of course, doesn't require a bank account. A nonprofit can send directly to advocates in the authoritarian country, which can then use those funds in a way without permission. Second, financial repression can occur through the operations of a patriarchal culture that denies financial freedom, for example, to women. Gladstein gives the example of Roya Maboo, an Afghani humanitarian and entrepreneur who started a software company, and we previously discussed her when we talked about Lynn Alden's Broken Money. She also mentions the work that Roya did and does. So Roya starts a software company that employs women in Afghanistan after the U.S. invasion in 2001. Sometime after that, payments are difficult. Even at that time, PayPal and Venmo are not available, and she can't just give cash to her female employees because the male relatives will confiscate that. But she was able to pay in Bitcoin. And we see other use cases also emerge from Roya's story. So one, she can pay in a way that's not confiscatable by people within this patriarchal culture. Another one is Afghanistan still was unstable. One of her employees fled Afghanistan, was able to take the entirety of her wealth with her in the form of a seed phrase, which is kind of like the personal password to a Bitcoin account. Didn't have to carry cash on her person, didn't, of course, have to bring her real estate with her. So we see the importance too, just in the recent history of Afghanistan, the quick fall of Afghanistan after the U.S. withdraws. People who didn't already have existing funds in a foreign bank account or in the form of Bitcoin, they couldn't quickly liquidate their house, their family jewels, whatever. They were stuck in Afghanistan, or if they left, they were stuck leaving all of their things in Afghanistan. But if you had Bitcoin, you could again flee as a refugee with all of your possessions on your person in the form of a seed phrase. And even today, Gladstone notes, Roya continues to fund underground schooling for girls in Afghanistan through Bitcoin. Third, in addition to Bitcoin, then fighting debanking and enabling pro-democracy activities, even in like patriarchal cultures where there's a culture of financial repression towards women, we see financial repression that also occurs as a history of colonialism and how Bitcoin remedies that. So in this essay, Gladstein gives the example of Togo. Togo is a former French colony in West Africa. After its nominal independence, it's still subject to kind of neo-colonial French rule, you might say, through the colonial franc, which is money that's controlled by France. So an early pro-democracy leader championed an independent currency, realized how bad of a thing it was to not have its own sovereign money. That leader, though, was then a few days before passage of a law that would have changed the situation. That leader was murdered by French paramilitaries, and a dictator was installed who is currently, or whose family still is in control of power in Togo. And there still is that neo-colonial called the CFA franc. It's a colonial money, again, that's controlled by France, and there's also kind of strong-armed favorable trade arrangements toward France. So there's this colonialism leading to monetary financial repression in Togo. Presently, there is an individual, Farida Nabourema, and apologies if I pronounced the name wrong, who is an activist seeking monetary freedom in Togo. She's pushing back against the colonial franc and the dictator's economic control, and she's using Bitcoin to do that. So an example of a pro-democracy advocate helping a pro-democracy movement arise that is undebankable, that uses Bitcoin so it can't be debanked as a form of monetary oppression by an authoritarian regime. Fourth, we see how the common person suffers from financial repression through the monetary system designed to steal from them, and how Bitcoin fixes that. So the common man in the street, not just the advocate, is affected by financial repression. Gladstein gives the example of Cuba, which has a sort of two-tiered monetary system where people earn in kind of a normal peso, but then this can only be used to buy certain very basic goods and things, for example, that doesn't include meat and electronics. For that, you would need this other special type of account, which usually has to be funded with foreign money, which the regime then harvests and gives people this fake money that they can use to buy these other goods like meat and electronics. So that two-tiered system obviously sucks. It's obviously a way that the government steals from people. So in Cuba, then people begin and increases to save in Bitcoin. And Gladstein notes that they began in a period for a certain period of time saving in Bitcoin in which the peso went down 90% and Bitcoin went up 2,000%. So there are now underground schools in Cuba that teach people how to safely use Bitcoin, and remittances to Cuba are also being sent in Bitcoin to allow people to opt out of that corrupt two-tier harvesting system that the government has imposed as a means of financial repression. Fifth, financial repression doesn't also, of course, just affect the common person. It also does directly target that traditional object of concern of maybe the pro-democracy movement, like the journalists and the explicit pro-democracy advocate. They are explicitly targeted by authoritarian regimes through financial repression. These people can now turn to Bitcoin. So Gladstein gives many examples of this. The essay is really worth reading just as a catalog of what people are doing around the world. And that is, again, how I was orange-pilled by Check Your Financial Privilege. It was the first time where I saw use cases, like people actually using Bitcoin out of necessity and not as some sort of hobbyist kind of fascination with the technology. Gladstein gives many examples. Belarus is one where the regime has systematically debanked media and the opposition, and where Bitcoin payments are now a normal part of activism, he says, safer than carrying notes across the border in your pockets. Obviously, if you want to get money into Belarus, you get stopped at the border with a bunch of foreign currency. That's not going to be good. Hong Kong, there, Gladstein notes, pro-democracy advocates have been debanked and so are now being subsidized directly through Bitcoin payments because they can't open a bank account, so they can't receive payments through many other kind of traditional means. He mentions Nicaragua, interesting because there, Daniel Ortega, the leader, has debanked church and universities, a kind of a wide debanking of civil society outside the state. Democracy advocates are teaching individuals there and civil society folks how to use Bitcoin. This targeted and retaliatory financial repression is only going to become more common. Gladstein notes that there are 110 countries currently contemplating, experimenting with, or implementing central bank digital currencies, money that is digital, money that is issued directly by the state and so controlled by the state. Digital, so you can program into it nefarious functions, prevent people from using it for certain things, implement social credit scores that interface with the money, prevent people from using it if they've done certain actions, things like that. So as Gladstein has cataloged, we see how Bitcoin addresses financial repression. For those who are reading the Journal of Democracy, they're concerned about democracy. We see now he's laid out the ways that financial repression is definitely a thing that authoritarian countries use, and Bitcoin is definitely a way that people are using to redress that. So again, financial repression is a form of debanking. Financial repression is a form of kind of just the texture of a patriarchal society, the norms that function as a form of debanking when women are not allowed to have cash in that society. Third, as a form of continued colonial control, as in Togo. Fourth, is a way to steal directly from citizens, as in the two-tiered system in Cuba. And then last, as a way that to directly target pro-democracy advocates, journalists, etc. So before we move on to the second part of the essay, I want to discuss all of this. This is a lot of information, a lot of really good examples of the way that Bitcoin, again, is actually used in the here and now. People like, what does Bitcoin do? What are the use cases? I mean, this essay is so rich in that. And so this first part, I mean, it's, give this to somebody who says that Bitcoin is useless.
Yeah. When I read the first part of it, the thing that was the overlaying theme to me was I kept going back to these terms of democracy and freedom, which they've been bastardized, I would say, in Western culture. Democracy is being claimed more by the left as everything's a threat to democracy. By the right, everything's a threat to freedom. And democracy can certainly exist without freedom. And we see examples of that in places around the world, especially where the United States has installed pro-democracy governments through CIA overthrows or through wars, and even to a large extent in the United States, where you have democracy, but in the last decade or so, we saw an erosion of freedoms, an erosion of the freedom of speech, an erosion of the freedom of expression, a freedom of assembly. And so I think that it's important to um, kind of reframe those terms in what they truly mean, which is that freedom enables a true democracy. You can't have the benefits of an actual democracy if you don't have the freedom of your money. And it Gladstein, I think, gets really to the heart of the matter here in understanding that the ability to have control over your own money is paramount when it comes to expressing those freedoms. I can be a journalist who exposes corruption, but I can't do it if I have no funds in order to publish what I'm doing or move in order to report on stories. And
Yeah.
so I think that was something that, because I know, we have primarily a Western audience. And so those are freedom and democracy are somewhat triggering terms. I know most people don't
Yeah.
associate themselves with like MAGA or woke, but they also are inherently kind of aligned with the values of one or the other. And so they're kind of drawn more towards whatever is accepted, the accepted flag being waved by their side,
Yeah.
whether it's freedom or democracy. And so I think, yeah,
Right.
it's really important to kind of like elucidate what those terms actually mean.
No, definitely. And don't be put off by the term democracy here if one does tend to look at the word democracy as merely a label hurled in a political debate,
Yeah.
right? The Journal of Democracy, I was reading a bit about it. It does seem to, within its pages, include critiques of maybe not democracy as such, but some of the things that are problematic about instituting democracy. I think what you note is the most important thing, that regardless of one's belief about whether any one particular country is a strong democracy, regardless of how one views current critiques of certain particular policies, like in the United States, as anti-democratic or something like that, it's undeniable that financial repression is not consistent with a form of democracy. If democracy, and broadly speaking, is like everybody has a vote, or there's some large percentage of the population that is franchised with the vote, then you you know being able to transmit and possess value is really essential to developing having the means to develop the sort of opinion and views necessary to reasonably exercise that vote. Money is just, I mean, as every Bitcoiner knows, like you see how it is the lifeblood of everything. Like these currents of value that flow really do, all of this structure built on top of it is an outflow or a kind of an outcropping of whether those are trustworthy, immutable flows of value, or whether those are corrupt and manipulable flows of value.
Yeah.
And so I think Gladstein really does a good job of laying out here, financial repression as a form of debanking. That's obviously going to make somebody, they're not going to be able to participate in democracy if they don't have a way to store value. They're not going to be able to get to the voting booth. They're not going to be able to um, get out there and spread their opinion to get people to vote for their candidate if they can't put gas in their car. If there's a culture, of course, that has norms that are inherently repressive and that those are embedded in government that just tend to subjugate a certain portion of the population, prevent them from having value or giving value to others, that also, again, like this financial repression, is such. It's interesting. Like one of Gladstein's big points here is, I think, I wouldn't want to say impose on him a frustration, but there's a concern that pro-democracy folks aren't focusing enough on financial repression and maybe are focusing on some of the facile concerns with everything is anti-democratic or everything is a challenge to
Yeah.
our democracy when it's a political position you don't disagree or you don't agree with, right?
Yeah. Yeah. We're more concerned with who goes into what bathroom and who gets to play what
There's this
sport
whole
and,
culture war thing in the United States.
that
Yeah.
kind of thing. And that's so secondary, tertiary to the
Yeah.
actual issue, which is the abstract. Like we grow up in this world and we think of money. We have this recursive definition of like money is the dollar is money. And what is it used for? Well, it's what you use to buy stuff and it's what people give you when you work. But the abstract understanding of money is that money is energy, that money is an abstraction of the energy that it takes to do work. And so it stands as a representation of that. And when there's something that you want, that you have the choice of, I can expend my personal energy in order to gain this thing, or I can trade some of the energy that I've already been rewarded for in the form of money in order to acquire it, to have that kind of understanding. This weapon of financial repression is taking away the energy of the movement of people who are trying to exhibit pro-democracy action, who are trying to, um, you know, bring more fairness to the
Yeah.
world. Especially in the United States. Again, another term that I think that we should really make sure that we sort of clear the air on is this idea of a patriarchy. We hear talk of a patriarchy in the United States all the time. The patriarch, but women are senators, women are billionaires, women are doctors and lawyers. There are countries where a patriarchy actually exists, and the patriarchy is such that you can't go to school, you can't have a bank account, you can't vote,
Yeah.
you can't drive.
Yeah.
These are things that we take for granted as um, these basic things that no one could ever infringe upon. But it's very easy to see that there are countries where, Afghanistan in particular, Iran, where those are freedoms that people used to have.
Hmm.
And then a patriarchal government is installed or installs themselves
Yeah.
and removes those types of freedoms. And for someone who I have four sisters, I consider myself an actual classical feminist. I want women to have the opportunities that men have, and to be able to make those choices, whether it is to be a mother or a lawyer or a doctor. Um, when you remove that choice, then that type of oppressive regime is something that I think it's just misunderstood when we use the term
Right.
patriarchy um, to describe what we see in the United States
Yes.
as compared to what
This
happens in
and
the
this
rest of the
is
world.
this is such a good point you're making because it goes to a consistent theme in Gladstein's work. Check your financial privilege. When we're thinking about things like democracy, patriarchy, we tend to look at it through our own Western lens from the United States. And so we tend to pattern onto that the challenges to those concepts that arise from within our society that tend to be much more much smaller in scope than what we see maybe in other countries like the Taliban and Afghanistan, which I mean, I don't even know if they're patriarchal. Maybe you would say it's like theocratic or something, but whatever it is, like the type of financial repression that they have towards women is something that is not occurring in the United States. And so with Bitcoin, then a common argument against Bitcoin is why do we need this? I can just like send you something through Venmo or PayPal. I can just go open a bank account. And so, I mean, this whole catalog of countries where these things are not possible. Check your financial privilege. If that's your response, that we don't need Bitcoin because I don't need Bitcoin because I live in a society where Bitcoin is not necessary for me, check your financial privilege. Check, the perspective that you have on the world as a product of who you are. Broaden that perspective, considering what is happening in Nigeria, Turkey, Russia, um, even Canada with the truckers'
Yeah.
protests where they froze the funds to that particular protest.
in the United States with
No, so
PayPal, with Airbnb.
right.
Airbnb has taken away people's ability to book a room because they posted something on social media that
Yeah.
Airbnb disagreed with. PayPal said that if you post something on social media, we'll just take, I think it is up to like $2,000 out of your account. And this is where Charlie Munger's advice of invert the problem is really matters, because we don't think that these things are a problem as long as we're on the side, or we are falling in line with whatever power is
Yeah.
instituting these controls. But invert the problem, like assume that the people that you disagree with are going to eventually take power and take control. And when they do, will they not simply use the same rails, the same
Yeah.
instruments, the same tools in order to attack you? And nothing lasts. We have such a short-term view. This is why, and Natalie Smolinski, this was the thing that she noted was the most impactful change in her life coming to Bitcoin, was that it lowered her time preference, that it made her look further into the future. And we need to look further into the future. We need to understand that what we exist under today is essentially a bully regime, whether you're in the United States or China or wherever. It's this temporary hierarchy of power that is, if you zoom out, you can simply look at it as it's a bully that's standing on the neck of someone, pulling money and power out of their pockets. And eventually, that bully is going to have to release that hold on the neck, or the neck is, the person is going to rise up. And what we want is to be able to exist in a world where, regardless of who is in power, we still have the same freedoms. We still have the same opportunities. We still have the same ability
Yeah.
to exist as individuals. And that's simply not the reality. It's not the reality in Togo. And that's very clear. It's not the reality in Cuba. That's very clear. But it's also not the reality even in what we consider to be the most free places in the world, in the
Yeah.
United States. And we need to recognize that what we live in, if we're aligned with who's in power, it's merely a temporary thing. And
Mhm.
that can all change in the blink of an eye. It can change in an election. It can change overnight.
Yeah. Some of this is covered, I think, in the second part of the essay. So I'm going to move on to the summary of the second part, and we're going to get back to some of these topics. So after Gladstein goes over the way that financial repression occurs around the world, and then how Bitcoin in these specific instances is used to as a means to remediate the difficulties that activists and individuals experience in the face of monetary repression, he continues on to advance the Bitcoin debate in the second part of this essay, for the sorts of like political scientists, academics, pro-democracy advocates who might read the Journal of Democracy, where this essay is published, who might now be open to Bitcoin's functionality. They've reviewed the first part of the essay. They see that it is being used by activists, but who might still have some reservations. So to these people, to this crowd, and of course to anybody else reading, Gladstein first makes the point: Bitcoin, not crypto or blockchain.
Yep.
So nearly 100% of so-called crypto tokens, he observes, are launched with the intent of enriching the creators. We've all seen these scams, and this is October 12th, 2025. We're in the wake of the biggest wipeout of the crypto market in history. Bitcoin mainly unaffected, but many of these scam tokens just plummeting to near zero. Max pain for those people, max pain for eternity, I imagine, because they're not going to come back, hopefully. But not to make light of the max pain either, because again, these are scams of the people who bought into them. These are normal people who wanted to get out of the financial system, and so they get into these scams, unfortunately. That's why we need to emphasize Bitcoin, not crypto or blockchain. Some of these scams Gladstein mentions kind of offhand are also trying to scam nonprofits by, imagine some token states they have some particular functionality for cross-border exchanges or something like that. The nonprofit then goes with that crypto. Gladstein does note that stable coins, where the type of coin where like the value is pegged to an established currency or commodity or something, are maybe in a different category than those pure like crypto tokens, which tend to be scams. Does have some current utility, and in some countries, stable coins are in fact preferred over Bitcoin. There are, though, risks with stable coins, he notes. They're centralized. Usually they can be confiscated or censored for that reason by the issuer, by the corporation behind it. They can lose their peg and go to zero, like the Terra situation. And they also, just generally as a philosophical point, increase state power and the network effect of state money. If there's stable coin pegged to the US dollar, you're increasing the network effects of the US dollar through the use of stable coins. So as an advocate or an activist with the bigger picture in mind, maybe you want to look at that. Maybe you want to look into a decentralized money without a state issuer or corporate issuer like Bitcoin. So based on this, Gladstein suggests a framework for democracy work: Bitcoin, stable coins, everything else. So first place Bitcoin, second place stable coins, everything else probably garbage. You really want to encourage people to not get into that. Second, Gladstein confronts three popular criticisms of Bitcoin: volatility and adoption, energy use, criminality. Volatility is interesting because, for the pro-democracy advocate, compare the volatility to the volatility of the currency in the country where someone is holding Bitcoin. Perhaps that's even worse. And then, of course, over a 5-year time frame, Bitcoin has been a great savings instrument. Adoption, Gladstein notes, continually increasing. He mentions an app called Tando, which I had not heard of, as facilitating Bitcoin payments in certain countries. And then energy use, we've discussed that extensively. Miners do not produce any emissions themselves. They're, in fact, more green than users of just the US power grid, because miners also seek out forms of stranded energy at the source: hydro, thermal, nuclear, wind, sources of energy that have excess at certain points they want to sell to any buyer. Criminality, Gladstein makes a couple really good points. Large scale criminal enterprises usually have excellent banking connections in any case. So, like,
And even notes the banks that they use, HSBC.
yeah, right. And also, I just love this too. At the end of the day, like, the dictators are calling individuals who use Bitcoin criminals because, of course, they have a vested interest in criminalizing the very pro-democracy advocacy that Bitcoin is funding. Bitcoin is a disaster for them, Gladstein notes. I'll read this quote because it's phenomenal. Ultimately, it is dictators who are the biggest criminals, and for dictators, Bitcoin is a disaster. Satoshi's invention puts money back into the hands of the people, giving them free speech, property rights, and open capital markets. This is exactly what dictators fear most, because they need censorship, confiscation, and closed capital markets to survive. This is why you see tyrants such as Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin criminalizing Bitcoin payments. Tyrants do not like money they do not control. And then in the third, before we go on to that, what's a lot of new things, new content there. The criminality, energy use, volatility, adoption as popular criticisms of Bitcoin. And then, of course, Bitcoin, not crypto or blockchain. Do you have any, like...
Yeah, one thing that I've been suspicious of stablecoins since they came out, because I look at stablecoins merely as a compressed way for an issuer of a stablecoin to arbitrate against the user's benefit of using Bitcoin. Like, stablecoins, it's a multi-billion, I think soon to be a multi-trillion dollar industry. And how do they make that money? Well, they make that money because you hold their stablecoin while Bitcoin goes up in value. And so over time, you certainly lose and they certainly gain. Naval Ravikant recently tweeted that stablecoins are merely central bank digital currencies with extra steps. And they truly are. It's programmable money. It's centralized. Someone else is in control. It exists in one place, not decentralized. And so there is short-term utility, sure, for if you really think that you have knowledge about the market and maybe you want to hold your position while you think it's going down. But as we saw 2 days ago, good luck picking those events because it can happen in 45 minutes.
Yeah.
And so he does a good job of elucidating the difference between Bitcoin, stable coins, and cryptocurrencies. But at this point, I would really even just say it's just Bitcoin. Stable coins, sure, they might have this short-term use, but in the grand scheme, and this has been Vladimir Putin's advisor recently talked about this, that stablecoins are a scheme that will allow for the United States to take all of their debt, push it into the cloud, and make the rest of the world responsible, and also give them the opportunity to issue ungodly amounts of more debt and
Yeah.
continue to raise and push that $37 trillion that we're currently in debt to even higher levels. Um, the predictions are that by 20, even the government's own predictions are that by 2030 we're going to see that number approach like $100 trillion. And so it's you do have to zoom out. That's why I think these conversations are so important. Yes, it's incredibly unfortunate that so many people lost so much money. $1.65 trillion was taken out of the crypto economy in a day. But that's why education is so important, to understand why you don't want to have your money in Atom, why you don't want to have your money in Ethereum or
Yeah.
Solana, because it can and will and will happen again, that it will just disappear.
Yeah.
Um, the power of open source and the power of decentralized is that everyone benefits equally and everyone suffers equally. And those are not traits that you see in crypto, and they're not traits that you see in stablecoins either.
Yeah, and it's useful, as you mentioned, as education for people as they're contemplating investing in crypto or whatever. But it's also just useful as a larger point to disambiguate Bitcoin and crypto so that people don't withdraw entirely from anything that uses encryption in order to create a new form of money or commodity or something like that.
Yeah.
Particularly that people understand that Bitcoin is not crypto, is not these other scam tokens. I mean, we can see in this newest market wipeout, people are also going to use that against Bitcoin. People who just kind of glance at the news are going to think, "Oh, Bitcoin's at it again." So being rigorous in your terminology and your explanation of concepts when you talk, clearly disambiguating Bitcoin, stable coins, not crypto. There's lots of funding going out by certain parties right now. You can see billboards up around town talking generally about cryptocurrency. There's one that has like a cowboy on it, cowboy looking dude, and it says, "Crypto is for me," to kind of like create the image that crypto is for every person. And there's lots of funding going in trying to make it ambiguous, trying to get people to, ride in on the good graces of Bitcoin, its preservation of value, its steady accumulation over time of value, so that they can market their other coins. So this is just such an incredibly useful point. For nonprofits. Nonprofits also, need to know when they talk with activists in other countries, when they try to transmit value to them, maybe be able to explain why they're not going to send some crypto and instead why they're going to send Bitcoin if some sort of, digital payments requested. Just such a useful kind of set of words to have in your mind and know the difference between. Yeah.
It's also just like a general lesson that we should apply in our lives, which is that you don't form your opinion about everything based on one experience. Walk into a restaurant and you have one bad meal and you assume that that restaurant is horrible and that you'll never go back. Or you walk into a bar and you see one pretty girl and you think that that's the place that the pretty girls go to. And you can't make these large rationalizations based off of one singular experience, because that singular experience is just simply not definitive of the
Yeah.
whole.
If I found a severed finger in my food, I wouldn't go back to the restaurant. Particular
It's
experience.
just a
It's like,
bad day for one chef. Just a bad day
There
for
could only be
one
10
check.
bad meals here. We're for sure of that.
Guy that's gonna have a hard time finding gloves for the rest of his life,
Yes.
wearing mittens.
Did you have any thoughts on the other aspect of this first part of the second half that we discussed, which is Gladstein's response to typical arguments against Bitcoin? Too volatile, that its adoption is not sufficient enough, only criminals use it, that energy use is bad when it's
Yeah.
done by Bitcoin and not by other things.
So too volatile, energy use and criminal use. So the first thing, too volatile. We first need to recognize that everything is relative and that the volatility of Bitcoin is upward, and the volatility of even the most stable government issued currency, which is the US dollar, is downward. And so you are guaranteed that over time, if you keep your money in the dollar, in the yen, in the yuan, and in whatever government currency you have, you're guaranteed to lose all of your buying power eventually at some point in the future. I'll repeat this and I'll repeat this. There's been 4,000 government currencies that have existed. 3,860 of them no longer exist. All of the rest of them are down 99% of their original value. So you're guaranteed, if you have the alternative, that you will be not just poor, but truly destitute.
Yeah.
And volatility on the upside is something that I think Michael Saylor has done just such a wonderful job of reframing what volatility means. Volatility means that there are people that want it. If you have something that is completely stable in price, markets are a place where people come together and they determine value through an agreement. And if that never changes, then what you're seeing is that there's no active negotiation going on. So stability is actually not desirable. Volatility is, we need to understand that volatility is desirable, that change is desirable. And we want to see that.
I
And
mean, it's not necessarily desirable. And sometimes you want a stable thing, though. You want something that is stable. Not everything needs to be stable, but
over the course of over the course of time, mathematically, if you simply just put the actual numbers to it and look at it as a math equation, do I want this thing that goes up 100% and down 80% and up 100% and down 80% versus the thing that only goes down 13%?
maybe you do.
Absolutely. Like there's
On
no
what time
question
frame,
from
though? On what time frame? If that thing goes down 80% and you need to spend the money that day, on a small enough time frame, maybe you do need the stablest thing.
right.
Yeah.
But then it comes to, now you're making the decision. You need to make the decision based on the probability of that occurring. And the probability of that occurring is 99% of the days, like with Bitcoin, 99% of the time, you're going to be in a better situation because it's going up. And then there's going to be these
Yeah.
short instances. So are you going to base your life decisions off of what is the worst thing that can happen, which is by the way, this is Nassim Taleb's, idea, is that, the barbell. Should I have my investments in the thing that is poised to break out, or should I have my investment in the thing that just stays stable? And he proves, which is fascinating because he's been waffling on his opinion on Bitcoin, but he proves mathematically that you lose if you stay in the middle, because what happens is that, because of the nature of the system, that creates bubbles, because we have government interference in markets that sends bad signal, sends noise.
Yeah.
There will be, like, those bubbles are guaranteed. Those are guaranteed. And so what can you do to avoid that? So, you make that decision based off of the probability of things occurring. That's why people live in San Diego. It's beautiful 99% of the time. 1% of the time you could have an earthquake. 1% of the time you could have something, but people still choose to live there, and they think that it's great because they make the decision based off of what is most likely to happen. That's why people engage in relationships. There's going to be a time when you find yourself in disagreement with someone, but the majority of the time you're going to find that things are wonderful.
Yeah.
That's why when you enter a relationship with somebody, you don't just look at, oh, they don't. Oh, I find myself pulling things out of conversations, but you you don't choose not to be with someone because of one small thing that you disagree on. You choose to be with someone because of the 99% of things that you do agree upon.
I mean, that goes far afield from like the fact that you just, in certain moments, you do need the most stable currency. As an investment thesis, sure, upward volatility is a better thing for an investor on a certain time frame. But if you need day to day to be sure that your bank account has a certain amount of money in it because you need to be able to feed your family, you need to be able to feed your family 100 nights out of 100, not 99 out of 100. You need the stablest thing. You don't, and if there's some things that are a little bit riskier, more volatile, you'll need a buffer against that. Maybe you have a certain, liquidity reserves so that you can let your Bitcoin weather some sort of downward moment. Regardless,
Yeah,
I
but,
mean,
but the better buffer is the thing that's gone up 100%, and it can go down 50% and still be higher than the thing that goes down 13% continuously. I mean, that's the buffer.
if
Like you're missing, like that's the thing that you're giving up on. You're giving up on your dreams. You're giving up on your opportunity to provide by saying, oh, I'm just going to limit my downside rather than maximize my upside. And yeah, I mean, this is where we may just have to disagree on this, because if you look at the history of Bitcoin, pick any 5-year period, pick any 5-year period, start on October 3rd, start on
Mhm.
October 8th, whatever, pick any 5-year period, and you're not just better by having Bitcoin, you are monumentally better.
except for if
And
you
so,
needed to suddenly repair your car at a point when Bitcoin nosedived in the past when it went
but
down by.
again, like this is like it nosedived to a point that is still higher than it would have been had you saved in your regular currency.
Not necessarily. If you start saving at a peak and then it nosedives and then you have a sudden purchase that you need, then you've just lost 80% of what you invested. I mean, nobody can wait 5 years for a purchase they might need to do. You need to have sufficient
Yeah.
reserves for a 5-year period.
And I don't think this is where I don't think it's a 5-year period. I think it's 3 months,
And
something like that, but always continuously
yeah,
keeping that 3-month reserve in
in any
there.
case, like volatility, it's the newest market wipeout shows that hopefully we can expect downward volatility for Bitcoin to not be what it was in the
Right.
past. So
Yeah.
some of this concern is also like here to there
10%.
because,
Right.
yeah, so
So,
hopefully,
the biggest wipeout in crypto history took Bitcoin down less than what you're guaranteed to lose by having your money in the most stable government issued currency.
but over a longer time period again. In any case, we're gonna end up disagreeing a little bit on on
Go ahead.
volatility. I'm fine being poor as long as I'm stably poor. I like some stability in my poverty. Can't have these upward swings so well.
So the next thing that you brought up is energy
Yeah.
usage. And this is something that I've talked about continuously. So first off, you need to understand that Bitcoin is a commodity. Commodities are wheat, commodities are cattle, commodities are milk. These are homogeneous items that are sold into a market. And this is why we see mega scale farms, mega scale ranches, because when you are participating in a commodity market, the way that you are able to survive and profit is simply by economies of scale, which allow you to be the lowest cost producer. And so in a commodity market, in order to be a lowest cost producer, when you apply that to Bitcoin, Bitcoin is the commodity. You need to minimize your inputs. And what are your inputs? Your inputs are the miners, and your inputs are the electricity that feed the miners. And the miners are also a commodity because by and large, there's only a couple of them that you can get. Everybody runs the same ones. And so that you can't differentiate yourself there. But the energy, that's the input that you can differentiate yourself on. And that's why we see that the Bitcoin mining producers of the commodity of Bitcoin, the ones that are able to survive are the ones that are being innovative in finding sources of stranded energy and sources of wasted energy. And these are sources of energy, to be very, very clear, these are sources of energy that are not currently used. They're not part of the grid. They're not taking away energy from the grid. They're not making it harder for you to turn on your lights. They're not making it harder for you to charge your car. This is natural gas that's being flared into the environment and burnt and just wasted. These are waterfalls in remote areas that it's just energy that's coming down that's not being used. And Bitcoin mining is now over 50% green in terms that it's using these types of energy. It is, I believe, the greenest market that exists in the entire world. It's 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 fascinating because in 2022 there was such a narrative around the energy usage of Bitcoin. And it turns out that the forcing function of being involved in a commodity market where you have to find the cheapest source of energy, Bitcoin is the thing that is driving us towards cheaper energy. It's driving us towards energy that is abundant.
Yeah.
And it's going to give us the opportunity to participate in a world that's much more abundant simply because we have more energy.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent summary of like we read some really good essays in national security in the digital age, and some of what you were saying reminded me of some of the Securing America's Future in the Age of the Electron by James McGinnis, Bitcoin Energy Security by Lee Bratcher and Pierre Rochard. There was a lot of, I mean, you did an excellent summary of a lot of different disparate points from those essays, but I think we've extensively talked about energy use in Bitcoin, and I really don't see people in the know who are against Bitcoin really even raising those arguments
Yeah,
anymore because they've been pretty,
that argument's been killed
yeah,
pretty hard.
people like you have done a good job. So,
The, the last thing that you brought up is the criminality part of it.
yeah,
And when I taught this in the Money, Inflation, and Bitcoin series, the way that I frame this is you first need to understand that any innovative new technology that is going to replace the current traditional system, it's always adopted by the people that are outside of that system. It's always adopted by the criminal enterprise that is excluded from participating in the traditional system. And that's why you saw during Prohibition, when people were running moonshine from place to place, those were the guys that first adopted the car because a car can outrun a horse. And so was the car an instrument of criminality? It was just a tool,
yeah,
and a tool is something that it can either be a weapon or it can be something that is used to your advantage. I can take this hammer and I can pound it in a nail and I can
yeah,
build a house, or I can take this hammer and, like my high school classmate, who is now known as Jimmy the Hammer, and murdered his
yeah,
stepfather with it, right? That, these things are depending on how you use them. Like a,
yeah,
a tool itself is agnostic of purpose.
yeah,
We give it purpose. And Alex does a great job of explaining and identifying, HSBC as, this is the bank that the criminals use. I told you about this. I just finished watching this movie I think it's called Infiltrator or The Infiltrator. And it's a true story of the cocaine trade, Pablo Escobar and the Customs Border Patrol setting up this sting operation in order to go at the funds. And what they found when they were able to bring this down was that they crashed the seventh largest private bank in the entire world because the criminals not only exist outside the system, they run the system, the dictators and the people that they put in power. And so they're the ones that are able to use those rails to their advantage. They're the ones that are able
yeah,
to obfuscate the true nature of their purpose and do it in plain sight and take advantage of using banks and using laws to get around the things that hold back you and I from engaging in criminal enterprise. But when you're at the top and you can make the rules and you're the one that sets the map, then you know how to get to the X.
yeah. And not only that, when you're at the top, you define the category of criminality as such. The very notion of transgression is defined by the authority who defines who are the transgressors, what is the transgression. So if you have the ability to define a particular pro democracy advocates' activities as per se criminal as such, then Bitcoin begins to look criminal because people who are promoting liberty and freedom are using this criminal technology of Bitcoin, the criminal purpose of trying to, reduce authoritarian control. And so it's just such a good point that dictators are the biggest criminal. Tyrants do not like money. They do not control. What they call criminal is almost certainly going to be, in certain cases, something that promotes liberty and freedom,
Yeah.
right?
Rules are the things that are put in place by the people that are creating the illusion that we live under, but laws are the things that we cannot avoid. The laws of physics, which are that which power Bitcoin, and also the laws of code, which is rules that are instantiated in a way that they cannot be changed.
Yeah,
And so everyone has to abide by that code. Everyone has to play by the same rules, as opposed to simply being able to, the example in the movie was that the drug dealer's money had been frozen by the United States government, and they wanted to get it out. And all they had to do was go to the head of the bank and say, hey, change the date of the deposit and put it before the freeze went into place. And now those funds are open. And
yeah,
so if you control the system, you can do that. But you can't do that if you're fighting against the laws of physics, and you can't do that if you're fighting against the laws of decentralized code.
yeah.
Yeah.
Now spoken very well are the resident natural law jurist here, Lucas Matty, on the nature of rule of law. That's pretty
Oh,
good.
man, I've just broken a lot of bones, and I know that it hurts.
So we'll move on to the final part of this essay. There's two final sections. In the next one, after we got moving sequentially forward, Gladstein gives a practical guide for nonprofit or human rights groups that's just getting started with Bitcoin. I'm not going to go into the mechanics of that. It's a good blueprint if you do have a nonprofit and you do want to send a grant to an authoritarian country or something like that. I mean, this isn't a step-by-step how-to, more of a here's some resources to look at. HRF, Human Rights Foundation, offers webinar. There's something called the Bitcoin Humanitarian Alliance, which I guess is a group of nonprofits that are using Bitcoin. An interesting one, there's the World Liberty Congress by the Venezuelan activist Leopoldo Lopez, that looks like they use Noster to in some way fuel the educational website, whereas like infrastructure for this educational website for democracy advocates. So some interesting stuff to look into. Read this if you want to see tools for your toolkit, if you're on the board of a nonprofit or interested yourself in doing some sort of activism.
Well, and that's just real quick, Noster, because even within the Bitcoin
Right.
community, there's not a whole lot of people who understand what Noster is. Noster stands for notes and other stuff transmitted by relays. So this is a decentralized protocol that is built on top of Bitcoin that allows effectively, if you want to think about this in terms of your traditional everyday life, you've got your Spotify account to listen to music, your YouTube account to watch videos, your Kindle account to read books, and your Audible account to listen to books, all of these different things. And they're all different companies, and they're all siloed in their information. You can't take your Facebook followers and import them to your Twitter account. You can't take your YouTube subscribers and put them into your Instagram subscribers. But with Noster, you have one login and one digital online identity. And that is the thing that you can use to navigate all of these other apps. So imagine a world in which you don't have 12 different apps on your phone in order to listen to music and watch videos and read books and do all these different things. You simply have one app, and that one app coalesces everything. And not only are you able to have a consistent identity, not only are you able to avoid this annoyance of having 30 different passwords for 30 different things, you're also able to take the asset that is your online presence and use it across these different formats. And not only that, get rewarded in Bitcoin. And we've seen this. We're now putting this Bitcoin Study Sessions podcast on Noster and growing a community there. And the difference is that When we have it on YouTube, we need to have 1,000 subscribers and 4,000 hours of total video time. And then we have to apply, and then we have to go through a process where they make sure that we're not doing anything that they disagree with, and wait another 3 months. And it could literally be years before you could earn 1 cent from a podcast or from your work on YouTube. Whereas literally within the first 45 minutes of having this podcast on Noster, we were able to receive value, actual value, where someone watched the podcast. We've got 68 total listens to this podcast on Noster. It's insignificant, yet we've actually made real money,
Hmm.
Bitcoin, from someone who listened to it and they said, oh, this is something that I find value in. I'm going to reward the creator. And I give the example of putting my music on Noster, where in 4 days of having my music on Noster, I made more with 3 songs than I did in 4 months of having my music on Spotify with 5 albums. And the difference is because that 30,000 people can listen to my music on Spotify, and all 30,000 of them could say, I love this. This is my favorite artist. This is the best thing that I've ever heard. And there's no way for them to reward me
Yeah.
for providing them value. But with 68 listens on, I have the same amount of listens as we have podcast listens. With 68 listens on Noster, I'm able to have one person go, oh, I like that. I'm going to give this
Yeah.
guy $5.
So
It's
No-
it's incredible what it allows for people
this
to
is
do.
a really good summary of Noster. This essay is called Why Bitcoin is Freedom Money, the role that Bitcoin plays in pro-democracy, could play in pro-democracy, well, does and could play in pro-democracy activism and activism against financial repression. If there was a similar essay about Noster, what would the title be? Just to summarize, if you could summarize Noster in one sentence, why Bitcoin is freedom money, would the essay be why Noster is freedom
I would say why Nostr is freedom for the creativity and
freedom
or
for
for and
creators?
for
For
creators,
creators.
because and it's not just creators of art, it's also
Right.
what Alex Gladstein is doing,
Hmm.
right? Where he puts this essay up on Nostr and people can read it and they can directly send HRF Bitcoin in order to support that, as opposed to currently what's the way that you support?
Yeah.
You buy the book, right? And
Why
or
Noster is freedom of contract, why Noster is a free market, or
yeah,
something, freedom of market.
yeah,
Eh,
and it inverts the current reward system, where all we need to do to understand how much value is being extracted from creators is to take the market cap of YouTube and Spotify and Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and add that up, because
Yeah,
their product is simply the platform. It's the actual value of that product is the network and the people who put things onto that platform, and they're the ones that currently capture all of that
right.
benefit, as opposed to the creator. So what is that? It's literally trillions of dollars that is creator value that is being captured by the creator of the platform.
Right.
And Noster flips that, and
And
it allows
I
for
would dearly love to see a similar essay in the Journal of Democracy or anywhere. If somebody wants to write the essay, what is Noster's role currently in activism? What could Noster's role be in activism if democracy or other advocates seized on it? So to move on to the conclusion of this essay, so Gladstein concludes with a section describing how Bitcoin is increasingly becoming freedom money, even though it's, as we talked about, kind of somewhat been ignored by human rights activists, by that whole community. He cites the Global Bitcoin Adoption Index produced by the Cornell Brooks School Tech Policy Institute, which has found that more than a quarter of citizens in countries such as India, Kenya, Nigeria, Russia, and Turkey report having used Bitcoin. More than 1 in 4, more
Yeah.
than 1 in 4 people in these countries report having used Bitcoin, and yet the technology is still somewhat ignored by the human rights community. Bitcoin conferences springing up around the world. Bitcoin conferences, from my external viewpoint on these conferences that are grassroots, run by people in the community, not some person I mean, to use kind of some leftist vocabulary, not some like white savior coming in and like, I'm going to do a conference for you and teach you guys everything. And then it's people in the country, people in these countries building like their own systems, their own ways to do things, how Bitcoin's going to be integrated according to the way markets work in there and the way the norms for association, et cetera. Um, Gladstein knows something interesting to kind of, I don't know how much he puts into this, but we might say there's a 10-year activist adoption curve. If you look at Signal and What's Up, 2010, some activists were beginning to use these kind of technologies, not widespread. They're ubiquitous by 2020. So there's this 10-year adoption curve for activists. Bitcoin, then we might say 2020, it's being used, but rarely among activists. So maybe the activism curve for Bitcoin adoption is 2030, if you like kind of adoption metrics. I thought that was an interesting one. Bitcoin is also in itself a movement, a form of protest against a failing monetary system. That's why Satoshi, you know, put the machine in motion, wound it up, and let it go out into the world. Its adoption is itself a form of protest. And Gladstein states it this way, to quote an excellent quote here: "The tens of millions of self-custodial wallet downloads and more than 10 million cold storage devices sold show help us understand the shift away from using traditional money toward Bitcoin is probably the biggest peaceful protest in history." I love that. Bitcoin, the biggest peaceful protest in history. And I'll conclude this just reading in its entirety. I think this is the concluding paragraph. And if not, it's a paragraph I quoted because it summarizes so beautifully what Gladstein is talking about. "Every day Bitcoin's reach inspires, even in the darkest of places. It has helped people to survive under siege in Aleppo, kept families afloat in Lebanon, gotten aid into Gaza, Burma, and Sudan, and even helped to rescue North Korean refugees stuck in northeastern China. Bitcoin is providing property rights, connecting people to the world, and keeping resistance alive, often in places where nothing else can reach. In January 2009, when Bitcoin launched, Satoshi Nakamoto may have never guessed where the invention would lead. But today, we can say, at the very least, it has earned the name Freedom Money."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I, without going too far backwards, I do want to say that, one of the reasons I think why Bitcoin probably has not been adopted by many of these philanthropy organizations is that we're now seeing that many of these philanthropic organizations really are not truly philanthropic, and they're existing as a front, or they're existing as a means of washing or hiding funds. And I think that one of the things that we're going to see with Bitcoin is we're going to see some clarity into that industry, into that sector, where it's becoming more and more obvious that using Bitcoin is the way to enable this sort of action and
Yeah.
participate in this peaceful. It is if you own Bitcoin, you're not just an advocate for sound money. You're not just somebody who is trying to get wealthy. You are participating in the largest peaceful revolution that has ever occurred.
Right.
And you are, as Jason Lowry frames it, as digital 1776. It is a revolution, and we're all in this together. We're all moving in the same direction there.
Yeah.
It is a beautiful thing. Before we close out, one of the I want to give a heartfelt thanks to Alex Gladstein. I did intend to mention this during my introduction, and Grant did bring it up. But without the work that Alex did, I wouldn't be sitting here with Grant, because this is how Grant was brought into Bitcoin, and people that are not financially motivated. People that are not simply looking for, a way to change their life monetarily, but people that are looking for, in an altruistic manner, they're looking for an opportunity to make the world a better place. Bitcoin is an avenue for that. And it's becoming more and more obvious that it is the avenue for that freedom of money is freedom of expression. It is freedom of the ability to move and freedom of the ability to assemble. Um, and so, yeah, thank you to Alex for this incredible work that he's done and continues to do, and really in Bitcoin, there's so many people that hold off of participating in Bitcoin because they're waiting.
Mm.
They're waiting for their government to allow it. They're waiting for their financial advisor to allow it. They're waiting for their company. There's a lot of people that still work for companies that if you hold Bitcoin, you're not able to work at that company. They're waiting for the billionaires to come in. They're waiting for BlackRock to make it part of an ETF. And this is against what Natalie Smolinski talked about, which is the bottoms up movement. There's so many people that are always waiting for permission. They're waiting for the top down authority in order to give them cover to participate. And what Alex has done bravely and courageously is go into the belly of the beast and go to the people who are suffering the most, clearly on the bottom. Those have been trampled down by oppressive regimes, and financial repression has been used as the tool against their um, ability to live a free life. And he has been making a difference in the lives of people that are not celebrated on social media. They're not celebrated on traditional media because they have not had a voice. They've simply existed in that void, and their struggles have been silent. Their struggles have been unobserved.
Yeah.
So the work that he has done, I think, is on par with any person that's ever been involved in Bitcoin, and continues to do that on a large scale.
Yeah, but not to minimize Gladstein's role, because obviously it played
Yeah.
an essential role in my own kind of orange pilling, so to speak. But I heard this was said at the Kansas City Bitcoin Summit. I forget by who, but you need to meet people where they're at as far as explaining Bitcoin to them. The person who it takes at the time, I was doing human rights related lawyering, representing individuals seeking political asylum, people fleeing their countries, refugees, and so that made sense to me, the vocabulary he was using. But it's going to make a lot. It's somebody who is a pastor in a church. Maybe they need another pastor, somebody who's religious, who knows the theology, how that interacts with the nature of Bitcoin. Maybe somebody who's a police officer needs to know something else. Needs to have a police officer talk to them. So we all need our Gladstein to come at us, and we all can be somebody else's Gladstein. If you're listening to this, you're pretty far down the road of becoming someone's Gladstein, becoming that person who has the Bitcoin ethos, understands the principles, but also has their own real world experience professionally, socially, whatever. And that's one of the most beautiful things about Bitcoin as a spontaneous bottoms up movement is it needs all of us, because it needs somebody who has the particular experience that you, whoever you are, has, because other people have that but don't yet understand Bitcoin, and they need somebody to come to them and explain it to them in terms that make sense to them.
Yeah. And that's why, here's a whole line of what.
It's the Bitcoin bookshelf
Yeah.
starts there. It actually goes over here. I don't know if it's on camera, but it continues on. So it's a steady work in progress.
There's a lot of Bitcoin books, but there needs to be more, and there needs to be more people writing about Bitcoin. There needs to be someone who writes about Bitcoin for a guy who races stock cars at his local racetrack to understand it. There needs to be Bitcoin writing and understanding and teaching for people that are professional athletes, for people that are mowing lawns. Everybody needs to, exactly like you said, everybody needs their Alex Gladstein. Everybody needs, as Natalie Smolinski encouraged us, everybody needs the peer that is going to find another peer in order to meet them where they're at and explain it to them on their level. You don't have to understand proof of work, and you don't have to understand cryptography. What you do need to understand is how Bitcoin changes your life, and how it changes your family's life and your friends and the people around you, to make the world a better place. That is the message, I think, is
Yeah.
to be the peer that is the person who brings someone else
Yeah.
there.
And I just want and Lucas has mentioned, quoted Smolinski, referred to things she said quite a bit. Just to plug our conversation with Natalie, if you're listening to this and haven't listened to that one, go back and listen to it. And not because Lucas and I added to that conversation. We did
Yeah.
our
We
best
could have
as
sat
interviewers.
in the corner.
We could have, yeah. We needed to lob some questions out to get some stuff out, but even that, man, we're not interviewers. Natalie did such a good job deciphering our questions, and in response to those, listen to the responses, because there's so much good in what she says, good with the capital G, that goes beyond Bitcoin. So I would just encourage people to check that out.
Yeah, it's profound. The concept of having incentives that are aligned. We're living in a world today where it makes sense for people to do things that are almost reprehensible. It makes sense for you to sell out. It makes sense for you to take advantage of the deal today and not play long-term games with long-term people. It makes sense for you to be the person who is concentrating on exits. I was at the network school, and one of the things that people bandy about as a point of pride often is how many exits have they been involved in? How many things have they built up to a high valuation and then sold and got out before it became obvious that maybe it wasn't the best tool, the best thing, or before some other competitor came in and undercut that competitive advantage. Um, and we're looking at a world where we're moving more into this idea of like, find your purpose, find your ikigai, find the thing that you can't master that brings benefit to the world around you, that brings you joy, that can support your lifestyle by providing you income, and that you can do for your life. Because when you do that, then you can go deeper and deeper and deeper, and you can gain expertise, and you can never attain, but you can search for mastery. You can search for mastery, whether it's in playing guitar or reviewing books or building bookshelves or fixing cars. That's what I think that's what we as humans, we desire, is to be able to be competent. And that's a signal to other people around us that we've dedicated ourselves to something. And the concept of aligned incentives is one that continuously bubbles out of being involved in Bitcoin, where we truly are all in this together and we truly all do benefit um, by global adoption of this, because it removes us from these oppressive regimes, or even from the ones that we don't even view as oppressive but are slowly seeping away the economic energy that we have in order to participate in the world and to be our best self and express our best self.
Right on.
Yeah.
Why Bitcoin is Freedom Money by Alex Gladstein in the Journal of Democracy. There's a link to it. I'm sure we'll link to it as well on Gladstein's page on his pinned tweet. Check it out. It's an excellent essay.
Thank you very much.